I want to welcome everyone to the space. This is Rafiq. I'm founder of Seven Pillars Community, and I want to thank you for joining. And this is the second live podcast that we've had. Last week we had the introduction podcast, and the topic was the nature of Logos. Why is Logos important? Um, and um, we covered the subject of Logos, what it means, how it relates to Seven Pillars, and the structure of freedom. And as I was explaining, just to do a recap, we were discussing how freedom is a condition that exists when you have structure resting upon a sound foundation, and that the foundation is logos. Logos is a Greek word um, from Greek philosophy, from the Greek language, that means order, reason, logic, rationality, things like that. And the nature of the universe, if the nature of our existence really is based upon some understanding of order. And without order and logic and rationality, the universe would not exist. It would need to, there are certain laws and rules that we all have to live by if we are to exist, and to exist um, in a way that's productive and meaningful. So essentially, what we're saying is we're all bound by, no matter where we are from, what we look like, or what language we speak, that there's a universal language which rests upon an understanding of reason and logos. And so, um, Seven Pillars is basically starting from the premise that civil society, nationhood, rests upon, or must rest upon, a recognition and a understanding and adherence to some basic form of logos, whether it's a common language, a common understanding, a common set of rules. And we see this in society, in just our everyday lives, in the physical world. As I was explaining last week, if you pass by any house, or if you're sitting in a chair, in order for you to comfortably rest upon that chair or comfortably live in that house, you have to have a firm foundation. And that foundation must be strong enough to support the weight of you and everything that's in the house. And so it has to have pillars that rest upon that foundation. So if there's any weakness in the foundation, then of course the pillars will not stand. They'll be unbalanced. You can have cracks in that foundation. If you've ever seen a building collapse, or if you've ever seen an earthquake, the floor collapses, right? And then the houses collapse. And no matter how strong the structure is, if the foundation is not strong, then the building and whatever's resting upon the earth will collapse from within. So this is a metaphor we can appreciate and understand. And so I was explaining that logos, or rationality, order, rationality, reason, truth, these are fundamental universal ideas, and they form the basis of logos. And the Greeks invented this term to as a one word that encapsulates all these things. So it means language, it means order, it means rationality, it means reason, it means morality, because all these things are related to one another. They're all stem from the same thing. Um, so as I was saying last week, that freedom is a condition of certain things. And one of those things, just like a building, using it as a metaphor, that freedom is something that exists when certain conditions are met. And this is particularly true in the civic space or when we deal with communities such as local communities, uh, state communities, national communities, and international communities, right? And the most important thing is the recognition of order, the recognition and respect for logos. At the same time that, if we are just in our everyday lives, we had to respect the the rules of construction, the rules of engineering, the rules of gravity, the rules of things that we take for granted often because they're almost invisible to us, even though they're hiding in plain sight. But there are certain invisible principles that govern the physical world, just like there are certain principles that govern the metaphysical world or the world of morality, of social interaction. Okay, so logos is a recognition by the Greeks and subsequently by Western societies of a certain code of conduct, so to speak. Um, and this is reflected in the various religions, uh, whether it's Christianity, Islam, Judaism, all different types of Western or universal religions, generally speaking, um, and even certain secular humanist thought that recognizes there are certain things that are derived from nature, that every human being recognizes as true. So, and if you're going to build anything, you have to build it upon a solid foundation. So that was the basic summary of logos, and seven pillars is based upon a recognition of a logos: rationality, reason, order, morality, certain universal morality, certain basic ideas of right and wrong. Okay, that we're all born with. Um, and just to use another analogy, you know, you know, computers are based upon a binary code, and that binary code, 0 and 1, everything else is built upon that. Um, so all of your programs, all of no matter how complicated they are, your computers, they all are based on a software operating system that is designed based on a set of common rules, protocols, right? So when you get to the root level of that, um, there's the digital code, 0 and 1. Just to take the analogy a little bit further, before we get into the topic of independence, um, if we just look inside ourselves in biology, we notice that no matter no matter the species or the type of animal, insect, uh, whether whether it's a human being or an animal, whatever the genus is, no matter how far back you go, whether it's plant life, if it lives, if it lives, it's based on a very basic code. And in DNA, we know it's based on ADGT, adenine, guanine, taurine, and and cytosine, right? Series of four nucleic acids that um, are used as the basic building blocks. And even those things are based upon certain rules because those nucleic acids are based upon certain configurations, and those configurations are based upon certain um, molecules and atoms, right? And those atoms are based upon certain forces of nature, and those forces of nature are based upon certain principles that are mathematical, that are unfaltering, right? So you have certain rules of physics or laws of nature that transcend the external things. They're almost invisible to us. But without those things, nothing can exist sustainably. And that's why you have to be very careful when you start to tinker with these rules without a recognition of the basic building blocks, the basic principles that they're based upon. So that's what Logos is saying. That's the very first thing. So now that I've recapped what we talked about last week, that that's the foundation of any structure that you want to build upon in a community, in a nation, whatever it is, a recognition of moral laws and a recognition of reason and rationality in your affairs and how you structure things. So let's just picture that in our minds as a building. You're trying to build a building, so you're laying the foundation. If you've been to a construction site, so we're looking at that. Okay. Um, so now, once we've laid our foundation, let's say once we've recognized uh, what the foundation is, of course, the next question becomes, what do you put upon that foundation, right? Um, and so that's where the idea of independence comes from, right? So independence it's a condition, right? It's like freedom, but independence in any society, has to do with a certain level of freedom, certain level of sovereignty. Sovereignty is another name for independence. Okay. Um, and you have many different types of independence, right? So in the context of a society, let's say it's a nation, any nation, in order to be free, right? Assuming you have recognition for the moral law, right? You want to be free and have sovereignty, independence. You have to create that condition. You have to respect the condition that independence exists or freedom exists when the foundations of natural law and the pillars that support them are in place. So when the pillars weaken, just like a building, freedom collapses slowly, not dramatically, but slowly. So the topic of today's discussion is, if we accept the principle of logos and if we accept the principle of rationality and reason as governing foundational principles, and that independence is essentially derived from that, that's one of the pillars. Okay. So let's look at some of the elements. That's one pillar, right? Let's look at the elements of that pillar. Because if you've been to any construction site, you will see that every pillar is typically designed so that it's not just one concrete block, also though sometimes it is. But if you really look at construction, you will see that the pillar is made up of several strands. Sometimes in construction, you have steel reinforced concrete, steel reinforced concrete. And in that steel reinforced concrete, what that means is you have within the concrete, you don't see it on the outside, but on the inside of that pillar, you have several strands of steel, very strong steel. So they wrap the steel in these little strands, right? And then they put a metal structure around it, a frame, right? So the pillar starts off as a series of metal strands, steel strands with a metal frame, right? And then once they get that frame, they take the concrete truck and then they pour the concrete into the frame. So it's like a cast, right? You probably have seen this. So, and then they let the concrete dry into a form, right? And then once it dries, they remove the cast off of the concrete, and inside is the steel cage or the steel pillars, and they remove the external casing. Okay, And then you have this pillar, and they keep doing that, right? So today we're going to talk about the first pillar of seven pillars, which is independence. Um, and we're talking about it from a political standpoint. And we've already discussed how it rests upon a moral understanding. So, what are some of the strands of that first pillar? And how does it get lost? Because that's the topic, right? So, as you can imagine, any nation, we're going to look at it from a high level as a nation. And you can start to, in your mind, take these principles and start to check them against things that you see happening, okay? The first pillar, the first strand, first wire strand, right, is financial dependency. I mean, you can do them in different orders, but we'll start with financial dependency, right? Um, and we see this happening when a country, even though it's politically free, it has something on paper that says we are independent. And sometimes, like in the case of America, we had a document that said the Declaration of Independence, right? And that document basically just stated that um, we are we acknowledge the fact that each individual is endowed by their creator with unalienable rights, the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So basically what you're doing is you're recognizing a fundamental principle. You're recognizing logos, right? You're recognizing a condition, right, as a principle, right? You're declaring that something that exists, right? Now the question is, how do you sustain it? It's a principle. It's a political principle. How do you sustain it, right? What are the elements of that independence? This is the question, right? So um, we understood that there has to be a respect for morality, right? Universal morality. People have the right to self-defense. They have the right to personal sovereignty, liberty, right? They have the right to life, right? And the right to freedom of choice, freedom of conscience, to pursue their own happiness. Um, and this is extended to the idea of being able to live on their land without their land being taken unjustly, to own land, right? Um, to buy and sell from each other and trade. So, but one of the issues, one of the strands of independence is financial dependency. So, a person can be free physically, but in bondage financially, either personally or as a nation. And so, one of the first concepts of of independence as the pillar is sovereignty and understanding the importance of financial sovereignty, right? So, because debt can just replace sovereignty over time. In other words, the more debt you have, the more stress you have on yourself because you have to pay the debt back. The more, whether this is as a country or as an individual, and we all have felt this, right? When credit is issued to you from someone else, a third party, in the beginning it feels good because you have money to spend, but at the end, if you don't pay that money back, or if you can't pay the interest, then the money just compounds that you owe, and eventually it begins to crowd out all the other things in your life, right? And it shifts power away from you, so you're no longer independent, right? So that's the element of financial dependency. So if you're really going to be independent, then the strands of that pillar must include a respect for financial sovereignty, right? So um, that's the first element, right? The second one has to deal with constitutional boundaries, right? That means a country can be, or an individual can be personally free or even have the structure of freedom. But if boundaries are not respected, personal boundaries, right, in your own life, you probably imagine this, people don't respect personal boundaries, or they don't respect um, social boundaries, political boundaries, either in expansions of power beyond what you granted them to do, what you've permitted the person to do, where everything is like an emergency and people's rights and liberties are disregarded. So that's a problem. That's how you can lose your freedom. And it starts off as exceptions, and then the exceptions become permanent, right? Um, so that's another strand of that pillar, right? Um, the second thing is weakening of your ability to produce, either for yourself, livelihood, right? You can be physically free and declare that you're free, but if you can't provide for yourself, if you're too dependent on someone else for your livelihood, then are you really free? Are you really independent? No. So, and that's true in the individual level and in the political and economic level, right? So, um, in order for that third strand, you would have to make sure that you had the capacity, the physical capacity to produce for yourself. It doesn't have to be absolute because none of us are absolute. We all live in balance with nature and dependent upon each other, but it's a certain level of critical core things that you should be able to do for yourself. You don't want to become too dependent on others, whether it's a nation or an individual. Otherwise, you can't really claim to be free, right? So, um, and then the third or fourth strand, which is sociological, um, is the cultural norms. So, for example, and this ties into logos, uh, if you don't know what right and wrong is, if you're not clear, if you're not rational, okay, if you're not reasonable, if it's difficult to understand basic principles of right and wrong, black and white, understanding the boundaries, and it's all tied, they're all related to one another. As you can see, they're all related to one another. This is why in the pillar, they're all tied. If you notice, if you see in a pillar, they're all intertwined with one another. The more intertwined they are, they're tight. And that's why they pour the concrete on as they're tightened together. They wrap the strands around each other to form a tight weave, okay, and structure. So these principles are related, they bleed into one another. But the cultural one is, if a country or an individual loses sight of their values, they can, to the point where they don't know what right and wrong is, they don't know what black and white is, they don't know what a man or a woman is, they don't know um, the limits, their own limits, either physically, so they overindulge, right, in things that are meant to be done in moderation. We've seen this a lot, and things like alcohol, drugs, gambling, right, vices. They call them vices. In the Christian tradition, they call them vices. The seven vices. What are the seven vices? For those who probably maybe have forgotten, there's lust, right, gluttony, envy, right, pride. Those are at least four, right? So you have hatred, antithesis of love, right? Um, so if you indulge too much in these things, uh, like greed, avarice, wanting a lot more than to the point where you want to take from others, which rightfully theirs, um, and disobey the rules, right? Um, so if you do that, then eventually you lose your independence and you fall in bondage to the things that you're indulging in, right? And how often have we seen that? People that indulge in gambling, um, indulge in drugs, or indulge in uh, uh, lustful activity. We've all seen this, or resentment, envy, uh, uh, envy of other people, or resentfulness between different groups. You know, so you cannot find happiness in other success. You resent other people's success, or you engage in division. This is all related to envy. A lot of this is envy, and then overconsumption, and then of course one of the big ones is uncontrolled anger, right? Where you allow your anger or reactions to cause you to make outbursts, and then those outbursts then spread, and you get mob activity, right? The mob, civil disorder, riots, all these things, right? So your freedom can be undermined by your own tendencies, right? Um, so uncontrolled anger, and then you have uh, another vice is sloth, the neglect, right? Where you don't care anymore, and this happens in your personal life, where you stop taking care of yourself. And one thing leads to another, right? You start overindulging, you stop taking care of your health, you stop taking care of your environment, you become sloppy, lazy, whatever. You disengage from the normal everyday things you need to maintain yourself. And this happens politically too, where people stop voting, they stop participating, they don't defend their rights, they don't defend their freedoms, and eventually those rights are taken away or they disappear, right? So you can see how the cultural cohesion, that would be like the fourth strand of that first pillar of independence, right? That's a very important idea. And you'll find that all these are related to logos. They all rest upon this foundation, this floor. They all tie into logos in one way or another. And each pillar ties into the other pillar. Just like in a building, each pillar has to be level with the other pillars so it can sustain freedom, right? So if you have pillars of a building that are uneven or not equally, that do not have equal strength, right? Then you'll have an imbalance, and the roof will not be will fall apart. The roof won't rest level, right? So if you think about freedom as the roof, the condition that exists when a house is properly built so that people can live in it, you have to have that roof, right? The rest on those pillars, and the pillars themselves rest on the floor. So it's not enough just to have the foundation. You have to build the pillars on the foundation, and each pillar has to be strong enough and level enough structurally to support freedom. So if any one of those elements is off, as you can see in any building, once a roof can be damaged, right? You get a hole in the roof and it damages something else, right? Inside. Similarly, if the pillar gets weak, the roof can fall off. Like if you have an earthquake or a tree falls onto it, right? Very similar, and the same analogy applies in a community or a nation. And this happens over time. Neglect, right? So again, this doesn't matter whatever your political ideology is or whatever it is, it's irrelevant. We're talking about universal principles. And you can take these principles and apply them to any situation that you're looking at. It's just that this framework is derived from the American experience, the American constitutional order, and a recognition of the natural law, natural rights. In the American idea, we believe in natural rights, natural law, which come from logos, right? A recognition of reason and order, and even a religious idea of God being the manifestation of order or rationality and reason, right? The origin of everything, right? So, um, so what are those? What have we discussed? What have we talked about? We talked about logos as the foundation, and now we've we've described the first pillar, independence, as one of the pillars upon that rest upon the moral foundation. Correct? That's the first pillar, and we talked about how each pillar is interdependent with the other pillar. In the same way that a building, all the pillars are independent, but in this case, we have seven pillars. Okay, so today we talked about the first pillar, right? Which is represented in the American experience, or in any experience of a nation, is the Declaration of Independence. The very first thing that you do is you declare your independence. You declare your sovereignty. It's the first a recognition of sovereignty, right? As a fundamental right of all peoples to be free, right? Sovereignty, personal sovereignty and national sovereignty, right? Provided certain conditions exist. But it is a principle. It's self-evident, right? Then the second principle is which we'll talk about next week, is the Constitution, right? Or the Bill of Rights. That's and then we will talk about public credit, and then we will talk about manufacturing. Then we'll talk about infrastructure, and then the last one we will talk about is discoveries and inventions or innovation. That's the common term they use now. So um, now that I've kind of described what I meant by independence and how it's weakened, um, we can obviously apply those principles to the situation in America, and how it's the nation, its independence has been weakened over time, and it didn't happen overnight, as I'm sure you can just observe what's happening now and what's happened in the past. You can argue that our financial sovereignty probably began to be eroded many, many years ago. Probably started off as a small crack in the strands with the establishment of private central banking. Um, but even more, even if you do not attribute it to that, you would have to look at the debt situation, which is, at least the last time we had a balanced budget was 1992, I think, or a long time ago. Um, and we've just had uh, snowballing of sovereign debt, and it's gotten to the point now where it's crowding out uh, real investment. So, and it's getting worse and worse because, as you know, the interest on the debt just compounds, and at a certain point, it becomes unrepayable. And who the important thing about this is that the more money you owe this money to people who purchase your debt, which is, it can be nations, it can be corporations, it can be other nations, it can be hostile nations, hate nations that are hostile to you, nations that are friendly with you, but are worried about your ability to repay the debt. It can be financial institutions, other financial institutions. So it could be individuals, okay? And so there's an old saying in the Bible that the the debtor is servant to the lender. So if you want to be free, You obviously do not want to be in a situation where you're financially dependent. And America has, unfortunately, despite how strong it is militarily, um, and in other ways, it's very strong. But you can see how gradually it's been um, its sovereignty has been eroded by financial dependency. And even you could get into the other aspects of independence, on the constitutional erosion, which we talked about earlier, where the constitutional limitations, the boundaries have been eroded to the point where the exceptions are now the rule, right? Emergency powers are normal governance now. So that's another problem you can see with America, where usually you have a declaration of war, or at least debate about certain things, and now it, we don't even have those things. So there's no limits. Okay, so you're not free because there's no limits on the power of the executive or the power of the government to do whatever it wants without accountability, right? So that's another way it's been weakened. And then you have, as you can see, um, capacity. The capacity of America has been weakened. You can see that into the loss of manufacturing, the decline of the infrastructure, and even some aspects of innovation. There are many examples of that. We can see, remember during the health crisis, the COVID crisis, we realized that our supply chains were too overextended and we didn't have access to certain critical medical supplies. Um, and then whenever there's later on, we realized that our supply chains for rare earth minerals were not, we lacked refining capacity to develop rare earth minerals, which are necessary for our technical uh, industries, critical industries, steel manufacturing, um, chip manufacturing, things like that. And these things are critical for an industrial economy. And over time, these things were outsourced or offshored and neglected to the point where they're not as robust as they need to be. And then when you run into a situation, whether it's a military conflict or uh, a environmental issue or you know, health crisis or whatever, and you need to ramp up capacity to deal with the problem, you don't have enough. And that limits you, right? That limits your ability to defend yourself, right? So we can see that that is a way that America has been weakened, its freedom has been, its independence has been eroded, because now you're dependent on other countries who may not be friendly to you or may want something in return, even if they are friendly, something that you don't want to give. So that's another aspect, right? Um, Another thing, aspect that we touched upon earlier is the cultural independence. So, in other words, I think you can all relate to the importance uh, of immigration, right? And how immigration can be a strength, right? But it can also be a weakness if it's not controlled, if it's not done with respect to logos, to reason and rationality. Now, what would be rational is letting people in who contribute to the health of the country, contribute to the country's culture, contribute to the country's values, adopt those values, assimilate, and expand the country's productivity, um, goodwill, you know, all those things are great, right? Because there are certain aspects of other cultures and other aspects of other people's, their brain power, their labor, all those things can contribute, right? But if you have an uncontrolled immigration and you don't know who's coming in, and then you don't vet those people that come in and they don't come in legally and they don't pay taxes or they can be easily exploited, or if you don't, they're not, values are not compatible, they commit crimes, then what you've done is you've undermined your sovereignty. because number one, those people are probably not going to assimilate, or they're going to have difficulty assimilating, right? Um, and if you let too many of those people in and you don't have a plan, then you're forced to either remove those people from society very dramatically, which violates certain principles, right? Due process, right? Because you have to make sudden and often very disruptive uh, uh, detention and removal of those people, deportation, right? Which causes problems, right? Separates families and things like that, right? Or you can take all those people who may not be fully assimilated and may not want to assimilate, but nevertheless are here, and then you make them citizens or you grant them permanent status, and then those values are not compatible. So you have an undermining of the culture, the dominant culture, right? And so you have a fracturing of social cohesion, right? Which goes back to logos, right? You have to have a set of universal rules, right? So if you have groups of people who don't believe in the same set of rules about how to conduct their affairs in society, with a certain basic set of assumptions about right and wrong and practices, then you start to undermine the foundation. So that's another aspect, right? So we can all see how America has been weakened, its independence has been weakened because of these things, and erosion of these respect for these logos and respect for these principles, right? The independence has been eroded. So, and this is not this is non-ideological. This is not left or right or conservative or liberal. This is just right and wrong. This is reason versus irrationality. You have to be rational in how you approach things. That means you have to be respectful of certain basic principles, right? If you're not, then you will not be able to maintain your society. You will not be able to maintain, just like you have a building. If you don't respect the laws of nature, you don't respect the rules, you will not be able to lay a firm foundation. If you do not respect the principles of construction, engineering, you will destroy your building before it's even built. Or if you build it and you don't properly maintain it and operate it, do predictive maintenance, check for cracks and, refurbish things. Eventually, over time, just like all buildings, if you go to old societies, after neglect, no matter how strong the building is, it will collapse. So you have to respect it. So um, I hope this brief introduction to independence and how it relates to America has been helpful. It's just meant to be an introduction. Um, and with that, I will leave it open to anyone that has any questions. If not, we can end it there. And then next week, we will deal with the next pillar, and which will be the fundamental rights, the Bill of Rights. And we'll talk about that pillar because that's a very, very important pillar, fundamental rights. Okay. So I want to thank you guys for tuning in. And until next week, have a great week. Have a great weekend. And we'll talk to you soon. Thank you.